The image has been floating around for quite a while now, and it's been on even some major news networks. It's this, a nuclear-powered flying cruise ship. Now, anyone with eyes can naturally point out some pretty major flaws with this vehicle's design. The aerodynamics, the structure, just all of it looks near impossible to actually fly. Not only is it pointless, but many features also appear to be simply over-exaggerated for the sheer sake of, oh, that looks cool, but it doesn't look cool, it just looks stupid and annoying and like a crappy clickbait article. So today, with no fancy explanations or anything of the sort, we will get straight to building a version that actually works. Now, in order to do this, we have to consider the actual design goals of this flying cruise ship. So after looking over the reports and the videos on this thing, I've gathered a little bit of information. It's intended to be an aerial cruise ship that can fly for months at a time without landing. It does this through the use of nuclear turbines, which use the heat produced by fission instead of combustors in order to expand the gases as they pass through the combustor stage of a turbine. Now, hypothetically, nuclear engines don't need to refuel for incredibly long periods of time, since after all it is, powered by the heat of nuclear fission, and it would only realistically need to land to be serviced. For this purpose, I plan to include at least 6 engines on this design for the sheer sake of redundancy in case of failure. Now, historically, nuclear turbines have not really been pursued. This is due to something such as high weight, high maintenance, and risk of irradiating an entire area in the event of a failure or a crash. Obviously, these are all super valid concerns, but for the sake of the video, we will only be worrying about the weight, and maybe the thrust. As per my channel average, we will be using Flyout to design this aircraft. For those of you who don't know, Flyout is an early access aviation building game. Due to the early nature of this game, many features and gameplay shown is set to change in the future. Since a lot is unknown about the true capability of a nuclear turbine, I will be going with rather conservative estimates on its abilities. Each turbine will have a weight of 1.5 times greater than a comparable traditional turbine, and it will have a maximum combustion temp of 1700 degrees Kelvin. This will keep the engines within what I believe to be reasonable constraints for a nuclear turbine. Now, according to studies conducted on nuclear engines by the United States, a very large aircraft would be needed in order to justify the use of these heavier turbines, not because of a proportional thrust to weight, but simply because the smallest of these nuclear engines that could even be designed was still quite large. But that's not it. The flying cruise ship needs to be able to dock smaller aircraft and ferry passengers through this system. Now this is the part where it gets interesting. In Flyout, multiple vehicles cannot really be docked yet. Of course, multiplayer in multiple vehicles is not yet supported. So instead, we will have to have a vehicle docking station as well as maybe making a vehicle that fits into it. Of course, carrying capacity of such an aircraft is also a large concern. The renderings detail an absolutely insane level of passengers, like genuine cruise ship levels of passengers. Obviously, we wouldn't be doing this, but we would be trying to carry a large amount of people in order to give this a cruise-like, or maybe a small luxury cruise-like feeling to it. Based on these god-awful renderings, it appears to be shaped like a cruise ship too, but this doesn't mean it's water capable. The engines, wings, and landing gear sort of give away that it's not supposed to be amphibious, thank god. Another contributing feature of this sky cruise is the visibility. The seating, the giant glass dome, the weight capacity, and that giant observation deck. It really is supposed to be essentially a flying cruise ship. Instead of making a real plane though, the rendering depicts essentially a cruise ship with wings. For this video, I plan on including all of these features but in a more sensible way. Unfortunately, due to the limitation as Flyout as well as just general physics, this thing wouldn't be nearly as big as the concept aircraft. I wanted it to be at least 200 meters long however, which was already pushing the limits of what's possible and is far above what's been done in real life. Anyways, obviously this thing does need to be able to land, right? So it would also have to be able to take off and land using the lengths of some already existing runways, so that way we could reasonably achieve this. I will be trying my best to make this aircraft take off or land from the Flyout runway, but if I am not able to, I'll settle for a takeoff rate less than some of the larger international airports of the world. It might have even been fun to make this thing an amphibious vehicle. I don't think it would work though due to the limitation of, just general physics as well as flyout. We'll settle for a land vehicle for now. So this thing was going to be utterly massive, and as a consequence this would be the most annoying build I've ever done. So to quickly list off the objectives before I start building, the aircraft needs to be at least 200 meters long, powered by nuclear turbines, and since they aren't in the game yet, I'll have to add weight and reduce combustor temp to simulate them. It needs to have a large observation dome and a large observation deck for the passengers. It needs to be able to dock smaller passenger aircraft, and it needs to be able to land on runways that exist on Earth right now. Well, I guess I sure had my work cut out for me. The first thing I did, of course, was build a fuselage. I wanted it to be at least 200 meters long, so I set a guide that was about 200 meters long to build the fuselage. The camera could only zoom out so far, so building something over 200 meters was incredibly difficult. While you can absolutely build it, I doubt that the designer was meant for aircraft this big specifically. After completing the fuselage, we found out that the fuselage alone would weigh over 900 tons. This thing was gonna be giant and heavy. The wingspan would end up bringing it over 220 meters wide as well. I used struts to support the wings more on this design, not for efficiency or anything, but just for the sake of structural support. Even though this thing was supposed to run on nuclear turbines, I still wanted to make it aerodynamically viable for the sake of getting it off the ground and maintaining control to a reasonable aspect. I made sure to include the dome on the back of the aircraft, while trying to round off the edges. For those of you who don't know, rounding the edges of glass takes the pressure off of the corners of an otherwise square window and transfers it to all along the curve, thus reducing the chance of breaking. It's the same reason that airliner windows are rounded at the corners. Either way, the dome was still pretty large, and my goal was to be able to include the same recreational area, albeit a little smaller, as to what you saw in the 5,000 person cruise ship concept. For the turbines, I actually needed to be able to file edit them to get the diameter I wanted. The stock in-game diameter is a maximum of 2 meters, whereas I needed them to be bigger. Settling for a diameter of almost 4 meters on the turbine, and an almost 7 meter fan. These turbines were massive. To give you an idea, just the intake of this turbine was larger than most box trucks. And after some testing, they put out more than 1,100 kilonewtons of thrust. Imagine each engine being 6 F-14s glued together pushing on the back of this aircraft. Obviously, if this were real life, this thing would need some rather massive leaps in structural technology in order to ever fly, let alone not tear itself apart with sheer forces, but we can just pretend it'd be alright for now. Speaking of volume, now that we have dimensions, we can roughly calculate the passenger counts and volume of each aircraft by comparison. Since the Skycruise is, let's just say, roughly 400 meters long, and has a radius of roughly 30 meters, we could argue that the internal volume, based on the volume of a cylinder, would be somewhere around 1.1 million meters cubed. My aircraft, coming in at about 200 meters long and having a radius of about 10 meters, had a significantly reduced volume, only about 251,000 meters cubed. This aircraft would only be able to hold maybe 1,000 people, or maybe a little bit more. Going strictly by a volume multiplier from our admittedly rather inconsistent calculations, we could assume that this aircraft would safely hold 1,000 people in the same luxury conditions shown on Skycruise. Significantly lower population than the Skycruise, this thing most likely wouldn't be nearly as impressive in size. But I think that's a fair trade-off for, something that might actually reasonably work and exist. Now, this thing would be heavy. According to the game at the time, it weighed over 3,000 tons. Absurdly heavy, ignoring the insane engineering that would have to go into the landing gear and brakes of such an aircraft. I decided that we should have as many different sets of gear bogies as possible in order to transfer the ground pressure as much as we could. This thing quite literally weighed as much as your average skyscraper. The difference is this thing had wheels and wings and jet engines. I also decided on this design to make working landing gear bay doors just for the sake of it. At this point we were just about finished with the main design. While we wouldn't be doing a full interior, we had to add a few comforts for the passengers, as well as a few of our final objectives. Next, we designed the observation pods. In the Skycruise design, there were 3 of these, as well as an observation deck. I had decided that we would have 2 of them on either side, in a significantly smaller and more aerodynamically pleasing observation deck. This was my least favorite part of the build. It just looked very dumb and added nothing to the design overall. Like, why couldn't we keep it in a little bubble or something? I mean, I'm sure nothing would be wrong with that, right? Whatever, we had to try and keep it at least somewhat close to the original Skycruise design. I hated this stupid observation deck. It only serves to get in the way and worsen the aerodynamics of the craft, but I'd still had to add it for the sake of the challenge. So anyways, after some designing of quick finishing touches within the rooms, the landing gear, the cockpit, and some very basic interior features, we were ready to fly. Before flight, we had to think about how this thing would be getting off the ground anyways. The whole point of this aircraft was that it was supposed to be able to take off and have little planes dock with it to bring the passengers and all the amenities on board. So that means technically we could go with absolute minimum weight for takeoff here, and that would be realistic. We would still be adding a little bit of extra weight just to see if we couldn't get off the ground within reasonable amounts of time. Otherwise, with our design complete and the decals applied, we were ready to fly. And here it was, folks. We had a working sky cruise, the size and weight of a skyscraper, producing 1/3 the thrust of the Saturn V space rocket, featuring the biggest brakes you've ever seen and 3 front landing gear just to spread the ground pressure. This thing was a monster. But on the inside, you got luxurious amenities such as a pool and observation decks. To board the aircraft, you would take a civilian airliner flight to a docking boom at the bottom of the aircraft. Upon attachment, you would simply take an elevator up and into the craft. Luxurious accommodations and gentle flight made sure that your journey was a journey to remember. I've also found with time that I've grown to love the observation deck on top of the aircraft. Yes, I know I said that I hated it earlier, but I've really grown to like it and just the cinematic and flying it around recreationally. It adds a certain charm to the aircraft that you really don't get with anything else. But either way, come board the Sky Cruise today and have the experience of a lifetime. Thank you all for joining me in this one, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.